This video was brought to you by the TLDR store, where you can find all of our countries with shoes pins, including both Turkey and Hungary. Get 10% off using code DEMOCRACY. Democratic backsliding. If you're thinking that doesn't sound good, then you'd be absolutely right, and it's something a number of countries are struggling with at the moment. So let's have a look at what this concept is and why it's a concern for Europe, specifically looking at Hungary and Turkey. In the early 1990s, an academic called Francis Fukuyama claimed that humanity had reached the end of history. He elaborated, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalisation of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. This isn't to say that democracy doesn't have its setbacks, indeed it might. He argued, though, that the trend was that more and more countries would become democratic, and that a global transition to another form of government would simply not occur. However, this claim has come under fire in more recent years. We've noticed around the world more and more countries that once were democratic are engaging in anti-democratic acts. Some are even becoming less democratic, a place somewhere between democratic and authoritarian. This is known as competitive authoritarianism. The three key things that show when a country has moved from a democracy to competitive authoritarianism is: number one, when there are no longer free and fair elections; number two, when there are less protections of civil liberties; and number three, when there's no longer a level playing field. With these things, though, it's important to note that there are still elections. Opposition parties can still compete without fear of arrest. It's just that the deck is stacked hugely against them, to the point where it's almost pointless for them even to turn up. So let's dive into these three elements of competitive authoritarianism and see whether it's managed to creep into Europe. To do this, we'll look at Hungary and Turkey. It's fair to say that for an election to be considered both free and fair, parties have equal access to the media, and it's unlikely for corruption, such as ballot box stuffing, to have occurred. It's worth noting that in democracies, different parties and candidates may use the media more and less than others, depending on the level of funding they're able to secure. The key difference is that of access. Competitive authoritarian regimes will deliberately suppress, often using the law, the ability of other parties to campaign by using resources of the state. The governing party, on the other hand, will often use the resources of the state to ensure that they remain in power. So, that's the hallmarks of a competitive authoritarian regime. Looking at Hungary first, we can see that the governing party, Fidesz, uses broadcasters and newspapers that are given away at train stations to benefit themselves. These broadcasters and newspapers are at least partially funded by the taxpayer. Additionally, at least 500 titles are published by media outlets that are owned by friends of the government. Similarly, in Turkey, the Turkish radio and TV stations give partisan coverage to the AKP, the governing party, making it difficult for opposition parties to compete with it. To make things worse, in 2018, Aydın Doğan sold the media arms of his companies, the most read online newspapers in Turkey, to a pro-government conglomerate. A pretty shocking example of the lack of fairness in Turkish elections is the fact that in 2013, the state-owned media channel TRT gave the AKP 204 minutes of coverage. The opposition parties got less than 3 minutes each. Additionally, there were accusations in the 2015 Turkish general election that the AKP deliberately used tactics that were tantamount to overt corruption in order to win the election. This includes using bogus opinion polls and claiming victory early on election day to discouraging opposition voters from turning out. It seems that this corruption could have also existed in Hungary. According to the Unhacked Democracy Europe group, there was widespread voter rigging and fraud in the 2018 Hungarian general election, an election that resulted in a huge victory for the incumbent governing party. Moving on to the protection of civil liberties, it seems that again, neither Turkey nor Hungary have exactly protected them. In Hungary, new defamation laws introduced in 2018 means that journalists can be fined if they've quoted someone who later turns out to have lied. Now, the issue here is that this extends to quoting politicians. So, for example, if a newspaper quoted an opposition party politician criticising the government, and if the court later determines that this was untrue, the journalists themselves could be fined. Now, this is already bad, but would be made worse if, for example, the judiciary was headed by a member of the government. But anyway, we'll get back onto the Hungarian judiciary later. Moving now on to Turkey. The governing party, the AKP, have introduced defamation laws, which means that people are not allowed to insult the president. In fact, in 2015, someone famously insulted the president on his Twitter account and received a 21-month prison sentence, which was suspended for 5 years. In 2019, it was found that 68 journalists were in prison in Turkey directly due to their work. Clearly then, both Hungary and Turkey fulfill the second criteria to be classified as a competitive authoritarian regime. As for the last element of a competitive regime, that of a level playing field, a good way to look at this is whether the institutions of the country, such as the judiciary, are independent and treat all political actors equally. As we alluded to earlier, in Hungary this level playing field has been slowly eroded. In 2018, Fidesz passed a law that meant the judiciary itself had less power, as it has been transferred to the government's justice minister instead. The justice minister is a member of the government, and therefore cannot be as impartial as the independent judiciary. In Turkey, similarly, the level playing field has also been eroded. In 2016, there was a failed coup attempt, which ushered in a 2-year state of emergency. During this state of emergency, the government biased the playing field quite significantly. Tens of thousands of people were arrested in relation to the coup and weren't allowed to return to jobs. Specifically though, the government gained the power to be able to appoint judges to the Council of Judges and Prosecutors. In effect, the judiciary is less independent than it once was, and coupled alongside the treatment of opposition parties and journalists in the state of emergency, this demonstrates that Turkey also doesn't have a level playing field. So it should be clear that both Hungary and Turkey meet all 3 criteria to be reasonably defined as a competitive authoritarian regime. Reasonably though, arguments could be made that individually these examples don't mean that a country isn't democratic. After all, the US President selects judges for the Supreme Court. And while this is true, the point here is that when taken together, there is a clear shift in both Turkey and Hungary away from democracy. This can be measured by looking at the Freedom House scores across the years. Freedom House measures how free a country is, with higher scores meaning less free. As the chart shows, under the government of Fidesz and the AKP in Hungary and Turkey respectively, the countries have become less free. Democratic backsliding is evident in both countries, and in many other countries around the world, demonstrating that perhaps democracy isn't as certain as Fukuyama may have had us believe. But what do you think? Are Hungary and Turkey good examples of democratic backsliding? Is democratic backsliding happening around the world? If so, what are some other examples? As ever, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you want to support the channel, or Turkey and Hungary, then pick up one of our high quality enamel pin badges. We have way more than just Turkey and Hungary too, so check out the full collection by clicking the link below and get 10% off with code DEMOCRACY.
Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.